So now we're going to talk about a for loop in VBA. You would use a for loop when you have a series of mundane, repetitious steps that are just so many that you really don't want to write all the code to do those steps one by one. A loop is, think of it as a repeat button. It's that type of command. It will do the same step over and over again for however long you specify. So in this example here, we have a list of inventory items for a clothing store. And in column D, we have quantity on hand. And what we'd like to do is create a VBA for loop that looks at each inventory item's quantity amount in column D, row by row, and checks to see if the quantity is less than 2,500 for each item. And if it is, then we want to put 3,000 in the cell to the right of it to signify an order amount, because we want to restock inventory that has less than 2,500 units on hand. If the value is 2,500 or greater, we just want to leave the cell next to it blank. So this would be an ideal situation where you would create a for loop. So to get back into the VBA editor, you can hit the keyboard shortcut Alt F11. We're going to insert a new module. We'll call this subroutine inventory orders. So the for loop begins with the keyword for, followed by a variable. Now, it can be really any letter or any short acronym you want, but usually it's a good idea to just keep it simple at one letter. So we're going to use X. So that, just think of this as a counter. So for X equals, now X being our counter, what do we want to count? Well, we know our first inventory item begins on row 3, and our last inventory item ends on row 25. So we want to have a counter variable from 3 to 25. Now, what we also need to insert in our for loop is an if statement, because we have a condition. What's the condition? Well, we want to look at the value in column D for each row and identify the ones that are less than 2,500 units. So we're going to insert an if statement, and obviously we're going to start referencing a range object. When you're doing for loops, it's much easier to use the cells object rather than the range. Not to say you can't use the range, you can, but the cells is easier when you have a for loop with a variable that's a counter. Why? Because you can input numbers for your rows and column indexes, and that way you can just plug your variable in for your rows, because we want to do a loop through all of these rows. So it just makes it much easier rather than having to think about referencing, D3 and using quotes and all of that. So our column index is going to be column 4. That will remain static because we always want to look at the quantity on hand. And our condition is if the quantity on hand is less than 2,500 units. That is our condition. So once you're done with your condition, you type the keyword then, and from here you can keep on typing to the right, but you can also hit enter and come down in an if statement, and it's just easier and neater if you do, so I recommend you do that. The then signifies your what you want it to do if true. Well, what we want it to do is, I'm just going to copy this cells object and change the column, because what we want to do is put a value of 3000 in the column next to it, which will be our variable row beginning at 3, column 5, which would be E3. Get a value of 3000 if that condition is true. Once you've input your condition if true, you can hit enter again to come down if you like, and what to do if false begins with the word else. So if that value is false, again, I'm just going to copy that and paste it in here because we want that same location to get a value. Well, we'll just say space, or a blank, not a space, a blank. So now we're done. We have our condition, what we want it to do if true, what we want it to do if false. You end an if statement with end if. So our if statement is done. So now what we need to do is think about the next cycle of the loop. So you're going to end with the keyword next and then list your variable, because how this works is the loop begins with 4 and a variable, count from 3 to 25. Well, when we start, that variable will get assigned a value of 3. So 3 will be plugged in anywhere x is. So it will go through this first cycle or loop and first evaluate row 3, column 4, which is D3. And then it will, if that condition is true, in row 3, column 5, E3, it will assign a value of 3000. If that condition is false, it will put a blank in that same location. The if statement ends, and then you get the keyword next and your variable, and it goes back up to the top to go through the loop again. This time the value of x will change to 4, and it will repeat on and on and on and on, and it will go all the way until this value up here gets assigned 26, and then it will see that the counter was only set to go up to value of 25, so at that point it will shut it off, and then the subroutine will end. So before I run this entire loop, what I want to do is just F8 through this a little bit, just to show you how the variable changes. So right now x is empty, so now x has a value of 3. And you can see that condition was true for that first row in our counter. So now x still has a value of 3. We go back up here. Now it's been executed again in the next cycle of the loop, so x has a value of 4. Now x has a value of 5. So you can see how that works. I'm going to stop this, clear this out, and then run the entire subroutine at once, just so you can see. So I'll hit the play button, and you can see anywhere where the inventory on hand was less than 2,500 units, we got a value of 3,000 in the cell to the right. So now what I'd like to do is take this just a little bit further, and in any cell where there's 3,000 units, signifying that we need to restock the inventory, we'd also just like to multiply that value of 3,000 times the cost per unit to get an order amount. So again, we can just copy what we've already done change this value to column 6. And then we're just going to copy the value in the column to the left and multiply it by the value in that same row of the third column where the cost per unit lies. And maybe we'd like to format the cells a little bit. So I might just come down here outside of the loop and say range F number format equals so that's just some of the standard number formatting with 2 decimals. So now we'll run this and see what happens. We get our total cost of the order for each of the items that needs to be restocked.